The auction hall reeked of ozone and desperation. Frank wiped his grease-stained hands on his coveralls, surveying the crowd of alien collectors and wealthy merchants. He hadn't come here to buy anything exotic, just replacement parts for his ship's aging hyperdrive. But then they brought out Lot 47. The creature was barely alive. Its scales, which should have shimmered with bioluminescent brilliance, hung dull and gray against its emaciated frame. The dragon, a genuine Valdorian skyfire, one of the rarest sentient species in the known galaxy, could barely lift its head. The auctioneer, a multi-limbed crevathie, rattled off details with clinical detachment, confiscated from illegal traders. Malnourished, possibly diseased. Selling as is. No refunds. The crowd murmured with disinterest. Dragons were worth fortunes when healthy, but this one looked hours from death. The bidding started at a pittance. Frank's jaw tightened. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of abandoned ships, broken machines, things everyone else had given up on. Things he'd learned to fix with patience and stubborn human refusal to quit. 500 credits, he called out. The auctioneer's eyes swiveled toward him in surprise. No one countered. Why would they? Sold to the human. Getting the dragon back to his workshop was a challenge. The creature weighed nearly 300 pounds despite its starvation, and Frank's cargo hauler groaned under the weight. He'd lined the bay with every blanket and thermal sheet he owned, creating a makeshift nest. The dragon hadn't moved during transport, its breathing shallow and irregular. Frank had worked on enough life support systems to recognize the signs. This creature was shutting down. Not on my watch, he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. Helen found him 6 hours later, surrounded by medical scanners he'd borrowed from the clinic, veterinary databases scrolling across 3 different screens, and a complex 4-drip he'd jury-rigged from ship fuel lines and sterilized tubing. Frank, what the hell? His partner stood in the doorway, her red hair wild from the station's recycled air. She was supposed to be negotiating their next cargo contract, not babysitting his impulses. It's a dragon, he said simply, adjusting the fluid flow. I can see that. Why is there a dying dragon in our workshop? Because everyone else saw a corpse. He looked up at her, exhaustion lining his face. I saw something worth saving. Helen sighed, but she was already pulling up her own terminal, accessing xenobiology databases. What do we know about Valdorian physiology? That was why they worked together. She understood. The first 3 days were critical. Frank barely slept, monitoring vitals, adjusting nutrient mixtures, researching obscure texts about dragon biology that most modern spacers considered mythology. Helen brought food, kept the workshop running, and fended off curious neighbors who'd heard rumors about the human mechanic and his doomed project. On the 4th day, the dragon opened its eyes. They were violet, deep as nebulae, and impossibly ancient. Frank froze, caught in that gaze. The dragon's telepathic voice touched his mind, weak, confused, but unmistakably present. Why? The question held universes. Why save me? Why care? Why try? Frank set down his diagnostic scanner and met those ancient eyes. Because you deserved a chance. Because everyone deserves someone who won't give up on them. The dragon's consciousness brushed against his thoughts, reading something deeper than words. Humans were strange creatures, short-lived, fragile, yet burning with incomprehensible determination. This one's mind was full of broken things he'd mended, lost causes he'd championed, a fundamental belief that nothing was beyond repair if you cared enough. You are different. I'm human, Frank said with a tired smile. We're stubborn like that. Recovery was slow. Frank modified his workshop, installing heating elements calibrated to draconic requirements, constructing a proper feeding station, even creating a shallow pool for bathing after Helen discovered dragons needed humidity for scale health. The transformation was remarkable. Within weeks, color began returning to the dragon's scales, first hints of bronze, then growing stronger into brilliant copper gold. Bioluminescent patterns emerged along its spine, pulsing gently with each breath. But the real change was behavioral. The dragon, who eventually shared that her name was HFY in the ancient tongue, rarely left Frank's side. When he worked beneath ships, she curled nearby, providing light from her luminescent scales. When he grabbed quick naps on his workshop cot, she draped her wing over him like a protective blanket. When Helen brought meals, HFY would trill contentedly, sensing the bond between the two humans. She thinks you're her family, Helen observed one evening, watching Kirithvie press her massive head against Frank's shoulder while he calculated thrust ratios. Maybe I am, Frank replied, scratching behind the dragon's jaw where she liked it. News spread quickly through the station. A human mechanic had brought a Valdorian Skyfire back from Death's Edge, something even the galaxy's best xenobiologists said was impossible. Collectors came with obscene offers. Research institutions wanted to study her. A Valdorian delegation arrived, shocked that one of their sacred kindred lived, offering ceremonies and honor. Kirithvie refused them all. Her telepathic declaration was unambiguous. This is my family. These humans. This place. I choose to stay. 6 months after the auction, Frank stood in his workshop, now expanded to accommodate a fully healthy dragon. Kirithvie had grown magnificent, scales gleaming like molten metal, wings that could span the width of 3 cargo haulers, eyes bright with intelligence and affection. She lay with her head in his lap while he reviewed maintenance schedules, her massive form radiating warmth. Helen worked nearby, occasionally glancing over with a smile that said she'd never quite understand his particular brand of crazy, but she wouldn't have it any other way. You know, Helen said, the Valdorians are offering a fortune as gratitude. We could retire. Frank stroked Kirithvie's snout, feeling the gentle vibration of her contentment. And miss fixing things? Not a chance. Good. Kirithvie's thought was warm with amusement. I have grown fond of this strange human practice of fixing things, including stubborn mechanics who work too hard. See, Frank grinned at Helen. She gets it. In the cold vastness of space, among species ancient beyond human comprehension, a simple truth had manifested. Sometimes the greatest power wasn't technology or telepathy or centuries of wisdom. Sometimes it was just a stubborn human mechanic who looked at something broken and said, "Not today." And sometimes that was enough to change everything.